Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in the Inland Regional Center on December 2, 2015, was light with manufactured festivity. It was the kind of forced cheer common to office holiday parties everywhere. Tinsel, lukewarm coffee, and the gentle murmur of colleagues making small talk. For the employees of the San Bernardino County Division of Environmental Health Services, it was a brief, welcome respite from the bureaucratic rhythm of their work, inspecting restaurants, public pools, and sanitation systems. It was a world of checklists and regulations, of quiet civic duty. Among them was Syed Rizwan Farook, a 28-year-old health inspector. He was known as a quiet, serious man, perhaps a bit socially awkward, but polite and diligent. He had been there earlier, sitting at a table with his colleagues. But then, without a word, he had slipped away, leaving his coat on the back of his chair. No one gave it much thought. People come and go at these events. Perhaps he had to take a call, or had simply forgotten something in his car. The party continued, a fragile bubble of normalcy against the backdrop of a sprawling Southern California landscape. That bubble was about to burst with a violence so sudden and absolute it would seem to defy all logic. Two figures, clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by ski masks, strode into the conference room. They moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency, raising AR-15-style rifles. In an instant, the holiday music was drowned out by the deafening, percussive roar of gunfire. Panic erupted. The mundane world of paperwork and potlucks was ripped apart, replaced by a storm of hot metal and shattering glass. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes, but in that sliver of time, the shooters fired over 100 rounds, leaving 14 people dead and 22 others seriously wounded. When the shooting stopped, the two figures calmly walked back to their black SUV and drove away, leaving a scene of unimaginable carnage. In the chaotic aftermath, as first responders navigated the horror, a terrible question began to form: who could do this? Who could harbor such hatred? The answer would be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The architect of the slaughter was not a faceless stranger, but one of their own. It was the quiet man who had left his coat on the chair. Syed Rizwan Farook and his wife Tashfeen Malik. They had left their 6-month-old daughter with Farook's mother that morning and then set out to commit mass murder. This case is not just the story of an attack, but of a profound and terrifying transformation. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a homegrown terror plot. We will explore the invisible radicalization that turns a neighbor into a killer, the meticulous planning hidden behind the facade of a quiet suburban life, and the unprecedented digital war that erupted in its wake, pitting national security against personal privacy in the courts and in the conscience of a nation. To understand how a county health inspector became a mass murderer, we have to look at the life he built and the life he concealed. Syed Rizwan Farook was, by most accounts, a product of a quintessential American upbringing, albeit one with its own quiet fractures. Born in Chicago in 1987 to Pakistani immigrants, he grew up in Southern California. His early life was steeped in the suburban rhythms of the Inland Empire, a sprawling collection of communities east of Los Angeles. His father was an engineer, described in later legal documents as abusive and alcoholic, a difficult presence in the home. His mother, Rafia, was a devout Muslim who worked as a clerk at a local hospital. Theirs was a modern, middle-class life, yet one shadowed by domestic turmoil. The parents eventually divorced, and Farook remained with his mother, the quieter, more stable force in his world. He was not an outcast in the traditional sense. He attended La Sierra High School in Riverside, where he was remembered as shy and unassuming. He enrolled in the ROTC program for a time, but didn't stand out. He was religious, attending mosque regularly, but not in a way that drew any particular notice from his peers. After high school, he pursued a degree in environmental health at California State University, San Bernardino, graduating in 2010. He was building a life that seemed utterly conventional. He landed a good job with the county, the very department whose holiday party he would one day transform into a killing field. He earned a stable salary, starting at around $50,000 a year, and eventually reaching over $70,000. He was the picture of assimilation, the son of immigrants, achieving a comfortable, unremarkable American life. But beneath this placid surface, a different current was flowing. Farook was deeply engaged with the digital world, and it was there that his ideology began to harden. He spent hours online, consuming extremist propaganda. He frequented Islamist websites and immersed himself in the teachings of radical clerics like Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born al-Qaeda propagandist whose sermons have been cited as an inspiration for countless terror plots. His online search history would later reveal a man methodically studying the art of war. He researched firearms, tactics, and bomb-making. He also began searching for a wife, not on mainstream dating sites, but on platforms that catered to conservative Muslims. He specified his desire for a partner who shared his devout, traditionalist views. He wanted a wife who would wear the niqab, the full-face veil, a practice not common even among his own religious family. It was a signal of a deepening conservatism, a move towards a more rigid interpretation of his faith that was diverging sharply from his placid, secular work life. In 2013, through an online matrimonial site, he connected with a woman in Pakistan named Tashfeen Malik. Her background was even more opaque than his. Born in Pakistan in 1986, she had moved with her family to Saudi Arabia as a young child. Her father, an engineer, had found work there, and she grew up in the profoundly conservative Wahhabi tradition that dominates the kingdom. She was well-educated, eventually returning to Pakistan to study pharmacology at Bahadur Zakaria University in Multan, a city known as a hub for various religious and extremist groups. By all accounts, she was a brilliant student, but also one who was becoming increasingly radical in her views. Friends and family noted a significant change during her university years. She became more withdrawn, more intensely religious, and began to espouse extremist rhetoric. She started wearing the niqab and grew critical of what she saw as the westernization of Pakistani society. The digital courtship between Farook and Malik was one of shared ideology. They communicated for months, their bond forged not just in discussions of marriage and a future together, but in a shared, violent worldview. Farook traveled to Saudi Arabia in 2013 and again in 2014, where they met in person and became formally engaged. In July 2014, Tashfeen Malik arrived in the United States on a K-1 fiancé visa. The visa application process, which included interviews and background checks by American officials, revealed no red flags. She presented herself as a modern, educated Pakistani woman seeking to marry an American citizen. There was no hint of the radical ideology she had cultivated. They were married in a quiet Islamic ceremony in Riverside, California, a month after her arrival. To the outside world, They were just another young couple starting a life together. They settled into a modest two-bedroom townhouse in Redlands, a quiet suburb not far from San Bernardino. Here, they constructed their double life with meticulous care. By day, Farook was a dutiful county employee, inspecting restaurants and public swimming pools. By night, he and his wife were preparing for jihad. Their life together was a study in lethal compartmentalization. They had a baby girl in May of 2015, an event that would seem to anchor a family to a future of PTA meetings and birthday parties. But for Farook and Malik, it was just another layer of their cover. While caring for their newborn, they were also amassing an arsenal. They legally purchased 2 AR-15-style semi-automatic rifles and 2 9mm semi-automatic pistols. They also began stockpiling thousands of rounds of ammunition, much of it bought online. Their preparations went far beyond simply acquiring weapons. They were learning to be killers. They frequented local shooting ranges, practicing with the very weapons they would use in their attack. Farook was a familiar face at the Riverside Magnum range, where he was known as a regular and competent shooter. He practiced firing in different positions, honing his skills, all under the guise of being a responsible, law-abiding gun enthusiast. At home, their garage was slowly being converted into a workshop for manufacturing improvised explosive devices. They studied the bomb-making instructions in Al-Qaeda's online magazine, Inspire. They purchased the necessary components: pipes, gunpowder, Christmas lights for wiring, and remote-control toy cars for the triggers. It was a methodical, patient process, carried out in the heart of a quiet residential neighborhood. To fund their plot, they manipulated the very financial systems they sought to attack. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Farook took out a loan of $28,500 from an online lender, Prosper Marketplace. This money was not for a new car or home renovations. It was seed money for terror. The funds were deposited into his bank account, and from there, he began a series of transactions designed to obscure the money's purpose, including wiring thousands of dollars to his mother, likely to care for their child after they were gone. They were not just planning an attack, they were planning for their own deaths. They knew it was a suicide mission. They took out life insurance policies and carefully arranged their financial affairs. They were settling their accounts with the world they intended to leave behind in a blaze of violence. Their digital life was just as secretive and purposeful. They were careful to cover their tracks, using burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. But their radicalization was an open secret in the dark corners of the Internet. Malik, in particular, was vocal online, though often under pseudonyms. It was later discovered that even before she came to America, she had been discussing her commitment to violent jihad in private online messages. The vetting process for her visa had missed it all. As the date of the attack neared, their activity intensified. They destroyed their personal hard drives and cell phones, a clear act of operational security designed to thwart any future investigation. They were trying to erase the digital breadcrumbs that led back to their motivations and any potential co-conspirators. But they would make one crucial mistake. They would leave behind Farook's work-issued iPhone, a device that would become the focus of a technological and legal battle that would resonate far beyond San Bernardino. The morning of December 2, 2015 began like any other. Syed Rizwan Farook and Tashfeen Malik woke in their Redlands townhouse. Their world was one of stark contrasts. The ordinary domestic rituals of a family with a new baby set against the extraordinary, secret preparations for mass violence. They dropped their 6-month-old daughter off with Farook's mother, Rafia. The excuse they gave was a doctor's appointment. It was a simple, believable lie, the kind told every day. It was the final, deceptive act of normalcy before they crossed a line from which there was no return. Farook then drove to the Inland Regional Center, a sprawling 3-building campus that provides services to people with developmental disabilities. His department, however, was merely renting conference space there for their annual training event and holiday luncheon. He arrived and signed in, mingling with the very people he planned to murder. Eyewitnesses would later recall his presence as unremarkable. He was quiet, reserved, just as he always was. He sat at a table with several colleagues, but he seemed distant, preoccupied. Around 10:30 a.m. he got up and left, leaving his jacket behind on his chair, a small, tangible promise of his return. But the man who would return would be unrecognizable. He met up with his wife Malik, and together they made their final preparations. They dressed in black, militaristic clothing, strapping on tactical vests loaded with magazines. They armed themselves with the weapons they had spent months practicing with: 2 Smith & Wesson M&P 15 rifles and 2 Springfield Armory semi-automatic pistols. Their faces were hidden behind black ski masks. At approximately 10:57 a.m., they returned to the Inland Regional Center. They parked their rented black Ford Expedition SUV and walked with grim purpose towards the conference building. They entered the room where about 80 of Farook's colleagues were still gathered for the party. There was no warning, no final declaration. There was only the sudden, shocking eruption of violence. They opened fire immediately, sweeping the room with disciplined bursts from their rifles. The sound was deafening, the chaos absolute. People screamed and scrambled for cover under tables and behind chairs. But there was little escape. The shooters moved methodically through the room, firing deliberately at the unarmed and terrified crowd. They were not spraying bullets wildly. They were aiming, targeting the people Farook had worked with, shared meals with, and exchanged pleasantries with for years. The fusillade lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was in reality only a few minutes. They reloaded their weapons at least once. In total, they fired between 100 and 150 rounds inside the conference room. When the gunfire finally ceased, the silence was punctuated by the cries of the wounded and the shrill, insistent beeping of the fire alarm, triggered by the gun smoke. 14 people were dead or dying. 22 more had been shot, some with life-altering injuries. Before leaving, the attackers placed a bag on one of the tables. Inside was a remote-controlled explosive device constructed from 3 pipe bombs linked together. It was designed to detonate after they had fled, to kill the first responders who would be rushing to the scene. They had brought not only murder, but a new level of calculated cruelty. They then walked out of the building, got back into their black SUV, and drove away, melting back into the suburban landscape as if they were never there. The first 911 calls came in at 10:58 a.m., painting a frantic and confusing picture of an active shooter situation. Police and emergency services descended on the scene within minutes, greeted by a nightmare. They found a building riddled with bullet holes and victims lying amidst the festive decorations. Responders immediately began the process of triaging the wounded and evacuating survivors, who were led out with their hands in the air. The initial police response was massive and swift, but the shooters were gone. The bomb they had left behind, fortunately, failed to detonate. A faulty remote control had rendered their final act of malice inert. The investigation began almost immediately, and it moved at a remarkable speed. In a typical mass shooting, the identity of the perpetrator is often a mystery, or, tragically, they are found dead at the scene. In this case, the attackers had vanished, but they had left behind a crucial clue: their identity. Multiple witnesses who had survived the initial onslaught recognized one of the shooters, despite the mask, as their colleague, Syed Rizwan Farook. His abrupt departure from the party just before the attack was too much to be a coincidence. Within hours, his name was broadcast to every law enforcement officer in the region. A massive county-wide manhunt was underway. The search for a quiet, unassuming health inspector and his wife had begun. With Syed Rizwan Farook identified as the primary suspect, a dragnet tightened around San Bernardino. The first and most logical place for law enforcement to look was his home. A witness tip led police to the townhouse in the neighboring city of Redlands that Farook shared with Tashfeen Malik and their infant daughter. As officers approached the residence on Redlands Center Street, they spotted a black Ford Expedition SUV, the same make and model described by witnesses at the scene, driving slowly away from the area. The vehicle's license plate matched the one on the rental agreement signed by Farook. The police had found their targets. When officers attempted to pull the SUV over, it did not stop. Instead, it accelerated, and a desperate, high-speed chase began. The pursuit tore through residential streets, with the black SUV weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds. From inside the vehicle, the fugitives began firing at the pursuing police cars. Tashfeen Malik, seated in the back, shattered the rear window of the SUV and opened fire with her rifle. Farook was at the wheel, driving erratically, while also shooting at the officers. It was a running gun battle, a scene of incredible violence and chaos unfolding on a quiet suburban afternoon. The chase continued for approximately 2 miles before Farook, his vehicle damaged by police gunfire, was forced to stop on San Bernardino Avenue. The final confrontation was brutal and intense. Farook and Malik emerged from their vehicle, heavily armed and prepared for a last stand. They immediately engaged the officers who had surrounded them, taking cover behind the black SUV. A furious shootout erupted. A line of officers, using their patrol cars as shields, returned fire. The air was filled with the sound of hundreds of gunshots. Passers-by scrambled for safety, and the neighborhood became a war zone. Farook and Malik were outgunned and surrounded, but they fought with furious determination. They fired dozens of rounds at the police, continuing the assault even as they were struck by return fire. The gun battle lasted for several minutes, but was incredibly one-sided in terms of firepower. 23 police officers fired an estimated 380 rounds at the suspects. Farook and Malik fired approximately 76 rounds back. In the end, both were killed in the hail of police bullets. Syed Rizwan Farook died on the street next to the open driver's side door. Tashfeen Malik died inside the bullet-riddled SUV. The manhunt, which had begun just hours before, was over. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the investigation was just beginning. The scene of the final shootout was a testament to the scale of their plans. Inside the black SUV, investigators found a staggering arsenal. Along with the 2 rifles and 2 handguns used in the attack and the shootout, they discovered over 1,600 additional rounds of ammunition. It was clear that Farook and Malik had been prepared for a much longer fight. They had intended to inflict far more damage than they ultimately did. The failed pipe bomb at the Inland Regional Center was just the first clue. The search of their Redlands townhouse would reveal the true depth of their plot. When FBI agents and bomb squad technicians cautiously entered the home, they found not just a residence, but a factory for terrorism. The garage had been converted into a workshop for making improvised explosive devices. Agents found 12 completed pipe bombs, along with a vast collection of materials to build many more, including chemicals, wiring, and fuses. The sheer quantity of ordnance was shocking. Inside the house, they found another 5,000 rounds of ammunition, bringing the total in their possession to well over 7,000 rounds. This was not a spontaneous act of workplace violence. This was a meticulously planned and supplied terrorist operation. The digital evidence was just as crucial, though initially it proved more elusive. The couple had taken deliberate steps to cover their tracks. Investigators found crushed cell phones in a nearby trash can and a computer hard drive that had been removed and damaged. It was a clear attempt at destroying evidence, a sign of sophisticated planning. However, their digital ghosts could not be completely erased. The most immediate and damning piece of evidence came from social media. During the attack, or shortly thereafter, Tashfeen Malik had used a Facebook account registered under an alias to post a public message. In it, she pledged allegiance, or bay'ah, to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the then leader of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This single post transformed the official classification of the event. It was no longer just a mass shooting. It was an act of terrorism, inspired and proclaimed in the name of a global jihadist organization. The FBI took over the investigation, and their focus shifted to a crucial question. Were Farook and Malik part of a larger terror cell? Did they have handlers or co-conspirators? The search of their home and digital devices was aimed at answering this question. While they had destroyed their personal phones, Farook had made a critical error. He had left behind his work phone, an iPhone 5C issued to him by the San Bernardino County Health Department. This phone, the FBI believed, could hold the key to understanding the full scope of the plot. It could contain contacts, messages, location data, a map of their activities in the weeks and months leading up to the attack. There was just one problem. The phone was locked with a 4-digit passcode, and it was encrypted. After 10 incorrect passcode attempts, the data on the phone would be set to automatically erase itself forever. The FBI had the phone, but they couldn't get inside. This technological roadblock would ignite one of the most significant legal and ethical battles of the 21st century, a high-stakes confrontation between the world's most powerful law enforcement agency and the world's most valuable company. The iPhone 5C was a digital black box. The FBI was certain it held vital clues. They believed it could reveal whether Farook and Malik had been in contact with foreign terrorist organizations, if they had received support or guidance from others, or if they were part of a larger, undiscovered terror network in the United States. In particular, investigators were focused on an 18-minute gap in their timeline on the day of the attack, after leaving the Inland Regional Center, and before the final shootout. Their whereabouts were unaccounted for. What happened during those 18 minutes? Did they meet with someone? Did they drop off evidence? The phone, with its location data and potential communications, might hold the answer. The problem was Apple's robust security. The data on the iPhone was encrypted, meaning it was scrambled into unreadable code. The only key to unscramble it was the user's passcode. The FBI did not know the passcode. They could try to guess it, a process known as a brute force attack. But Apple's security software was designed to prevent this. A feature could be enabled that would automatically wipe the phone's data after 10 consecutive incorrect guesses. Furthermore, there was an intentional time delay between each guess. meaning it could take years to try every possible combination for a more complex password. The FBI was locked out. Initially, the FBI worked with Apple, and the company provided data from Farook's iCloud backups. But the last backup was from 6 weeks before the attack, leaving a critical window of time undocumented. The data on the physical phone was what investigators truly needed. So, on February 16, 2016, the Department of Justice went to court. They did not ask Apple to break the encryption itself. Instead, they asked for something arguably more profound. They obtained a court order compelling Apple to create a new, custom piece of software, a specialized version of its iOS operating system that would disable key security features on this one specific iPhone. This custom software, which quickly became known as GovOS, would need to bypass or disable the auto-erase function and eliminate the time delays between password attempts. This would allow the FBI to connect the phone to a computer and run millions of passcode combinations in a short amount of time, effectively brute forcing their way into the device without risking the destruction of the data. The legal basis for this request was a piece of legislation from a different millennium, the All Writs Act of 1789. This law gives federal courts the authority to issue orders necessary to aid their jurisdiction. The government argued that compelling Apple to write new code was a reasonable and necessary step to complete their investigation into a deadly terrorist attack. It was a novel application of an ancient law, one that sought to conscript a private company into creating a tool to undermine its own product's security. Apple's response was swift and uncompromising. The day after the court order was issued, Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, published an open letter to customers. He argued that what the government was asking for was not only burdensome, but also dangerously unprecedented. He stated that creating this GovOS, even for a single phone, would be equivalent to creating a master key or a backdoor into the iPhone. Once created, he warned, this tool could be used over and over again on any number of devices. He argued that it would undermine the security and privacy of every single iPhone user. The government is asking Apple to hack our own users and undermine decades of security advancements that protect our customers, he wrote. We can find no precedent for an American company being forced to expose its customers to a greater risk of attack. The dispute ignited a firestorm of public debate. On one side were law enforcement and national security officials, who argued that access to digital evidence was essential for preventing future attacks. They framed the issue as one of public safety, accusing Apple of prioritizing its business model over the need to bring terrorists to justice. James Comey, the director of the FBI at the time, insisted that the request was limited to this single phone, and that it was about finding justice for the victims. He argued that in a world where criminals and terrorists go dark by using encrypted communications, law enforcement needed new tools to keep society safe. On the other side were Apple, a coalition of other tech giants like Google and Facebook, and a vast community of civil liberties and privacy advocates. They argued that creating a tool to weaken encryption, even for a good cause, would set a catastrophic precedent. They warned that if the U.S. government could compel a company to build a backdoor, so too could authoritarian regimes like China or Russia. They argued that strong encryption was a fundamental pillar of modern life, protecting everything from personal conversations to financial transactions and critical infrastructure. Weakening it for one purpose would weaken it for all purposes, leaving everyone more vulnerable to criminals, hackers, and repressive governments. The battle lines were drawn. It was a direct conflict between the imperatives of national security and the right to digital privacy. The legal fight intensified. Apple formally challenged the court order, and a high-stakes legal showdown was set. The case was poised to become a landmark decision on the limits of government power in the digital age. Tech leaders, security experts, and human rights organizations filed amicus briefs in support of Apple. Families of some of the San Bernardino victims filed briefs in support of the government, making a powerful emotional plea for access to the phone. The stage was set for a dramatic courtroom confrontation that could redefine privacy for generations. Then, just one day before the scheduled hearing, the government made a surprise move. On March 21, 2016, the Department of Justice filed a motion to vacate the court order, effectively calling off the legal fight. They announced that an outside party had come forward and demonstrated a method for unlocking the iPhone without Apple's assistance. The government no longer needed to compel Apple to create the back door because they had found another way in. The monumental legal battle, the one that was supposed to settle the great debate of our time, had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. A week later, the FBI confirmed it had successfully accessed the data on Farook's iPhone and had withdrawn its case against Apple entirely. The identity of the third party was not officially disclosed, but it was widely reported to be an Israeli mobile forensics firm, Cellebrite, which was paid a substantial fee for its services. The great standoff was over. The government got what it wanted, and Apple did not have to compromise its security. But the central question at the heart of the dispute was left unanswered, deferred for another day and another case. And what of the crucial data on the phone? What secrets did it hold about that 18-minute gap, about potential co-conspirators, about a wider terror network? After weeks of intense public speculation and a legal battle that had captured the world's attention, the findings were anticlimactic. The FBI announced that the phone contained no evidence of contact with foreign terrorists or a broader conspiracy. It appeared to confirm that Farook and Malik had been self-radicalized, inspired by foreign terror groups, but not directly commanded by them. The 18-minute gap remained a mystery, but the phone provided no new leads. The digital treasure chest that had been the subject of an epic struggle turned out to be largely empty. The investigation confirmed that the plot, while sophisticated in its planning and execution, was born and bred right there in the Inland Empire, a product of two individuals and their immersion in an online world of violent ideology. The other key figure who emerged from the investigation was Enrique Marquez Jr., a longtime friend and neighbor of Farook. Marquez was the one who had legally purchased the two AR-15 style rifles used in the attack several years earlier. He would later tell investigators that he and Farook had been plotting attacks together as far back as 2011 and 2012, targeting a local community college and a notoriously gridlocked section of a state freeway. Those plots were aborted, and Marquez eventually distanced himself from Farook. He was not aware of the specific plan to attack the Inland Regional Center, but his role in providing the weapons was undeniable. In 2017, Marquez pleaded guilty to charges of conspiring to provide material support to terrorists and making false statements in connection with the acquisition of the firearms. He was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison. His case served as a stark reminder that even homegrown terror plots often have roots that stretch back years, with warning signs that are only recognized in hindsight. The aftermath of the San Bernardino attack left a community grappling with profound loss and a nation confronting a new and insidious form of terrorism. The 14 people who were murdered at the holiday party were not abstract statistics. They were parents, children, spouses, and friends. They were public servants who dedicated their careers to safeguarding the health of their community. Their names were Robert Adams, Isaac Amanios, Bennett Abetbadel, Harry Bowman, Sierra Claiborne, Juan Espinoza, Aurora Godoy, Shannon Johnson, Larry Daniel Kaufman, Damian Mines, Tin Nguyen, Nicholas Thalasinos, Yvette Velasco, and Michael Wetzel. Their deaths left an irreparable hole in the fabric of their families and their community. The 22 who were injured carried both physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. The event forced a difficult conversation about the nature of radicalization in the Internet age. The case of Syed Farook and Tashfeen Malik was a terrifying case study in how the path to violent extremism can be walked in almost complete secrecy, hidden behind the walls of a suburban home. They were not members of a sleeper cell sent from overseas. They were a married couple with a baby, radicalized by online propaganda, who successfully planned and executed one of the deadliest terrorist attacks on U.S. soil since 9/11. They demonstrated that the modern battlefield is not just in a distant desert, but also in the quiet glow of a laptop screen in a residential townhouse. The ultimate outcome of the legal case was clear. The perpetrators were dead, and their primary accomplice was sentenced to prison. The investigation concluded that they were self-directed, inspired by ISIS, but not operationally controlled by them. The community of San Bernardino began the long, painful process of healing, marked by memorials, vigils, and a resolve to not be defined by the violence inflicted upon it. The Inland Regional Center, once a symbol of tragedy, reopened, its employees demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of trauma. The physical space was repaired, but the memory of what happened there would forever remain. In dissecting the anatomy of this homegrown terror plot, we see that its most chilling feature is its very domesticity. The plot was not hatched in a clandestine meeting in a foreign country, but in a Redlands apartment, between diaper changes and trips to the grocery store. The weapons were not smuggled across a border. They were purchased legally from local gun shops. The radicalization was not the product of a charismatic leader preaching in person, but of a disembodied ideology consumed through screens. Syed Farook and Tashfeen Malik built a facade of absolute normalcy, a life so conventional that it became the perfect camouflage for their extraordinary hatred. The anatomy of their crime is a map of a modern pathology, where grievances and extremist beliefs, amplified by the echo chamber of the Internet, can metastasize into a detailed plan for mass murder. But the legacy of this case extends beyond the crime itself. The fierce standoff between the FBI and Apple over Farook's iPhone revealed a deep and unresolved fracture in our society. The attack forced a head-on collision between two fundamental values: the need for security in an age of terror and the right to privacy in an age of ubiquitous technology. The government's attempt to compel a company to write code to break its own security set a powerful precedent, even though the case was ultimately dropped. It opened a Pandora's box of questions that we are still grappling with today. Where is the line between lawful investigation and government overreach? Can we have security without sacrificing privacy? Can we have privacy without creating spaces where criminals and terrorists can operate with impunity? The San Bernardino case provided no easy answers. Instead, it exposed how the technologies we have created to connect and empower us can also be used to isolate, to radicalize, and to arm those who wish to do us harm, leaving us to navigate the treacherous terrain they leave behind. The San Bernardino attack revealed a new kind of terror, one that germinates not in a foreign training camp, but in the quiet glow of a computer screen in a suburban townhouse. It left behind not only a community shattered by loss, but a society forced to confront a terrifying new reality, that the deadliest threats may not be those crossing borders, but those already living next door, hidden behind a digital wall of their own making. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.